This is definitely a continuation of Sunday. There's a reason for that. Reason is, well, I'm always right, and you'll never see it. You know, I can tolerate things that nobody else in existence can tolerate. That's a fact. And I can do it from I'm always right. I doesn't ever have to let her touch it. I doesn't ever have to let anybody else be right about it. One nice thing about putting the burden on myself as God at a time, it's going to be an extension of Sunday. That's that. Because I'm going to talk about compression, I'm going to talk about severing, and I'm going to talk about, I'd be right to say nothing in the universe appreciates what happens there. And it's pretty consistent, and it has to be, because I'm always going to be right about it. And whether there's any expertise at being right about things that has, you know, a near to perfect track record, I isn't talking about that in this discussion, because it isn't the same, it isn't me, it isn't God, maybe, quote, essentially. And I'm not opening up that discussion, because I'm always right doesn't have time for it. And that's the point. Because I'm going to know things against the strongest popularities. I'm going to know things against the highest readinesses anything has available in any memory anywhere. I'm going to have things because I'm always right. And, you know, it might be a very long time before any of that information comes to light. It might be a heck of a lot longer than anybody that thinks they're right has time to wait for. And that's the other point. It's because if I can have that, well, it might be real convenient for all the things that doesn't put it on themselves as God, that doesn't have I'm always right without anybody ever being able to touch it. For all the times we're all supposed to just die while things change we have no control over. Might be rather convenient. I'm always right. Can sever or compress a thing or two. But the awareness of that type of idea, well, it has a history and it has a relationship to pressure. It's definitely traceable, if not next to impossible to keep separate from any amount of preparation. I didn't say it is impossible to keep it separate. I just said it's next to impossible to keep it separate. You know, there's a difference between myself extending Sunday, putting it on myself, and knowing that I'm always right as a formidable, and what exists to know it's next to impossible to keep track and keep it separate of every time there's an idea history about the context. In that I maybe have a relationship to defining, look, everything that ever comes to have a concept of these ideas, well, there's a history, and there's a pressure history, there's a relational history, there's a status history. And all that information may or may not be kept mostly separate, totally separate, partially separate. Any amount of details might not ever be kept with a whom or a keeping or an investment or a bank. Anyway, maybe I have a relationship to defining what that means. Maybe I've had it in the past, maybe I'll have it in the future, maybe I'm having it right now. Anyway, there's a difference between me putting it on myself as an extension of Sunday and anything having to do with focus of defining that. They're very, very different physical relationships. They have maybe completely unknown impacts on what severing or compressing will ever occur in proportion to time, or any definition of the measurement of physics, or any definition of the measurement of survival, or any definition of anything's attempt to covet such pressures as if it's a utility beyond always being right types of utilities. And that's highly defined too, because maybe there's instances where something needs to validate something about a survival sever in proportion to a compression at any point in time, but these respects really aren't general. It's very, very different. God placing an extension on himself in the middle of time and be against all pressures to the contrary without any need to be concerned, finally, about pressures of the contrary because of how right it is to do and know, for instance. It's a different reality and concentration about defining the pressures, or defining realities. Anyway, the point I was trying to get across is that the delicacy to know or experience what I just said isn't going to be there most every time, every case, every place, every time. What I was trying to get across is there's going to be chaos defining what happens in proportion to those respects of those words, in proportion to pressures and definition in time. There's going to be chaos. And it might be a very big frame of war, of death, of impossibility, of obstacles, to ever climb the shadow of that mountain, to see it true, or see it repeatably true, or find it inarguably true, and why anything might ever covet the memory of such an illusion ever happening in time. It's all right up there with always being right. It's all right up there with isn't the same thing as clarity of focus. It's all right up there with you isn't ever going to have a simple time valuing or balancing energy along these concentrations or concerns, any number of completenesses, or places that are going to enable you to rest decisions in proportion to what you see. You know, somewhere in the pages of very well-kept antiquity, something might realize that as I'm speaking, it's a highly critical concentration. As it's evidenced, it's a highly critical record. The pressure maybe isn't exactly respected or openly valued in a vagary by any sense of the comprehension anywhere. But it's clearly a very powerful time period. In another sense, having any read of these types of concentratable problem status in all time comparisons, what happens at these focuses? What happens? What isn't known? What couldn't be known? What couldn't be felt? What couldn't be seen? endless amounts of concerns in proportion to power that isn't touched or comprehended in any number of stretches. Where things are read, there maybe isn't a lot of decision that is possible in proportion to a lot of variables. And there's clearly a lot of knowns about those realities, maybe too many knowns, maybe unsafe amounts of knowns at all points in time. Who knows how they've ever been defined, and you get these assumptions of what these statements might mean at a decibel or at a memory or at a problem state. At any rate, what I'm trying to get across, as it's opened up or as it's elaborate or as it's seen in a bisection, clearly it's quite a dilemma to know that needs vitality to define it without a higher limiter, and to define it next to finally in proportion to any velocity of knowing in time at any pressure, in proportion to always being right and all other sorts of types of variables. There's going to be a lot of respective variables and knowing to ever maybe accomplish such a feat of necessity beyond the faces of anything that is ever attempting to thwart such comprehension or necessity in time. Very, very delicate, very, very elaborate decisions clearly have been made in proportion to such variables, but maybe it doesn't ever change the fact that where these things are ever read, once the boat is in motion, once the plans are already specified, once the genetics are already tuned for specificity, there's maybe definite periods of pressure where it isn't possible to rest decisions in proportion to the read of a pressure. So there are clearly differences. You know, I say this is an extension of Sunday. I isn't at the read. What God is a different definition. What is placing it on itself is a different definition. What these things mean to time or anything or gravity or physics, they're all very different than being at a read or being at a simple assumption. Anyway, I isn't going to specify everything that I think, but you know gold is kept separate for a reason. It isn't to put these eyes in your shoctart. Better hurry up and get dog to the gravity machine so you can make like you BouND the CoNDom wrapper. I'll tell you what it is. They exercise. I'll tell you what it is. They exercise. You or they don't know who they're praying to at these speeds. And she ain't gonna like you very much when she wakes up. Matter of fact, who woke you up to it is heavier than the Armory. It isn't going to take you forever to realize is where she had to go to love me. For instance, I mate her and man to a bound of trajectory. It's going to be a vibrative, transient, unconditional bounding of sorts. For instance, she can't define any number of things about this conversation. And yet, only her might ever face a read of who, what, when, where, hi, or wow has ever attempted to embrace her focus of such concentrations. Maybe only her. That might be rather formidable in space history. Not only as a living or a truth or an anchor or a determinant of solution of any number of pressure seekers in proportion to reigning ideas in a math or in a grid or in an environment, in a pressure, curbing of any number of energies, all based on bounding impossibility or frequency of reads of something just like now. For instance, she would be someplace and she'd maybe realize that bounding impossibility is a slaughter of possibility, because what she might ever need to feel, or what might ever need to be real in her mind, in the dimensions she is provided for such impossibility maneuvering, in the spectrum of keeping and separating and other parallels to bound and survival utilities aren't decrepitating in tandem to the safeties of such possibilities of impossibility. It's a slaughter of possibility. And there's clearly maybe the highest desire to ever craft altruistic vantage in proportion to necessity of bound. In other words, being her faces what at the proportion her readiness to navigate impossibility is consistent with survival paths. You know, if man and her are bound to that bound, well, her navigation of impossibility faces what in proportion maybe to the highest desirable altruistic fixation construction attempts. Anyway, there's knowns, such as, well, the pressure of the consideration only happens when. And then there's knowns of when that's known, X is exhibited or comes to evidence in proportion to such pressures. And there's clearly more record of those things ever being looked at in tandem or in completely different segments of concern of pressure, i.e. Inability to see those continuums in real time yields what certainty to continual survival bound pressure. Because it might not ever be in anybody's interests, not to mention survival plane survivors' interests, or anything else quantified or classified or designated or termed or named or considered in proportion to survival term limits and designs, proportion to time. Anyway, there's clearly a rate within which existing, navigating, maybe depending on a curvature of bound, is an experience that is for what purpose? For what growth of mind? For what concern not to grow as a mind? You know, am I competent, considerate, clean, safe, and aware enough of my relationship to impossibility to navigate dimensionally at a slaughtering of possibility? Are my aims to preserve the bound possibilities, or are my aims to grow experience, such as comparing the priorities of the bound navigation, trying to knowing that and trying to define anything. As I said, any word or concept that works its way into the frame or mix quite probably is a marketed attempt to create altruistic something in proportion to complicating what otherwise might be genuine or honest self in investment or in awareness or in devotions or dedications to living or principles of existing in time. You know, it isn't simple to know, as a pressure exists in a relationship is evident, that any variable isn't existing for harmony of vitality. It isn't simple to know that. And it isn't simple to explain when an entire dimension, for instance, is compressed to a status of zero survival. It isn't simple to care that a severed connection, for instance, as an alternative to a dimensional compression, is somewhere in a tolerance, or somewhere in a forgiveness, or somewhere in a needs to know, or needs to continue, or needs to care, or needs to respect, so on and so forth. Anyway, these relationships as they happen, it isn't simple to care about dealing with it and respect or know. As I talk about it, I isn't sitting here physically myself putting all the burden on myself forever. In your mind, you're not seeing forever. There's forever, there's me, there's this burden I'm placing on myself, and it's going to be a burden on me forever. You aren't seeing that in your mind. You probably aren't respecting the fact that it isn't quite that simple to look at me speaking, specifying, concerning, caring, and also valuing this burden, or also valuing it's an extension of Sunday, because I'm always right. It isn't simple to know or cause yourself to limit endeavorship because of such positions of time or reality or fate or destiny or grace, massive forces that can't be touched at any point in time. It isn't simple and certainly probably isn't expected by anybody. And therein lies, a very unvisited position of altruism. Altruism maybe tends to be a facility of opportunity to reduce friction of things that can't be dominated. And yet, when you respect the position of what isn't in that frame, you might expect to find that an altruistic modus is very disrespectful or negligent or neglectful of prime concentration about the vantage of that altruistic position. That altruistic position maybe isn't harmonious for camouflage, maybe isn't harmonious for ambiguity, maybe isn't harmonious for creating as many excuses as possible for the greatest mass of idiots. And whatever holds the vantage of that altruistic knowing is maybe very much older than all of them. It's maybe very much more competent in always being right than maybe all of them or most of them at any juncture of perplexity, of connection, necessity in time. Here's the point. Everybody isn't going to either be respected or paid or, there's maybe no rate they ever need to learn this for a moral benefit. They aren't going to develop a moral character for knowing this. But the always right is going to concentrate comparison of necessary argument. And that altruistic vantage is maybe going to have a lot to do with focus continuums. For instance, any number of arguments or headbuttings about energy or resources or decision are going to happen. Maybe most of the time, always right and necessity and vantage from that altruist, they're always neglected. They're always outside of respect, and they're always part of bound continuums that are maybe ultimately or near to ultimately sensitive to any number of continuing variables at any point in time, meaning impossible, untouchable grace that might ever exist in proportion to space-time continuum, planes of existence, survival, vectors of decision and knowing and surviving, trajectories, bounds. Graces of those mights. Clearly, there's a lot of knowledge about where there's a lot of disrespect of necessity at any pressure. Burden is placed on answers, and it maybe isn't clear to anybody. The burden placed on answers doesn't come in a reciprocity to be fielded or known or appreciated along any number of timely or real or aware functions of explanation, meaning as time elapses and relationships occur, data clearly amounts in proportion to some of these knowns of logistical knowns, but because they're so dang sharp and they're so dang impossible and they're clearly not simply part of somebody's simple self at any point in time, not to mention being somebody to talk about it or place weight of variables at a necessity in proportion to it. The burdens placed on necessity, you might find, are very obscure potentials. even if he doesn't ever find it, because maybe he isn't looking for it. Maybe you're just taking my word for it, and that's that. You might realize they're very obscure variable potentials. And, I mean, very obscure variable potentials in proportion to incredibly, immaculately critical variable pressures. There's clearly a lot of preciousness in the consistency and the knowing. Precious comparison clearly faces the least amount of problems, where precious comparison isn't touchable, isn't navigable, isn't in somebody's hands to wield in senses. Anyway, maybe you can imagine a lot of logistical comparison happening at no direct anybody's ability to dissect what is valuable in the data to any specificity. You might imagine such untouchable flows would have to travel and knock and scratch and kick without any awareness, without any drive, without any navigation, all up against other sorts of logistics, other sorts of knowns, other sorts of pressure reads, other sorts of vitalities, necessities, ambiguities, you name it. And even the fallout, even the product, isn't entering a logist. The product isn't entering a wield. The product isn't entering a tangible environmental relationship. The product is maybe stocking in always right, someplace where it's maybe not ever used, maybe not ever useful, maybe not ever needed, maybe not ever a variable, any number of dimensions. You might imagine grace of impossible to dominion being a rather critical vitality in proportion to potentiality of concept and elaborateness of security in proportion to ensuring that bound safety and priorities follow curves, follow definition for reasons that are locked in to priorities that are maybe very much supportive of other priorities. So impossibilities for the sake of preserving more impossibilities for the sake of preserving, maybe in the grander scheme of things, maybe preserving life as we know it, maybe preserving time as we see it or have the culpability to relate to it. You know, somewhere along the line there are limits to what need be let or need be capable or need be, you know, you're getting past the point of it being good for anybody, and you're furthering your footsteps into the dimensions of it is going to cause catastrophe in the right set of circumstances types of things. And, you know, maybe a consideration like that in the always right department has maybe been there all year, maybe longer than that. You know, as a world develops, or anybody learns, or any relationship adapts or evolves, these types of considerations might not be impossibly forever apart from continuums of velocity of survival. Just because he doesn't ever see or relate to what knows it doesn't mean it isn't there. Doesn't mean it doesn't know it. Doesn't mean it hasn't seen it. Doesn't mean it isn't on its way to something. Maybe she'd be navigating someplace. Just herself. Just some knowns. Just some unattackable moments as far as any number of forces are concerned or interested in causing problems or imagining at any point in time. It's a hard reality to define. Everything in the universe is going to stop at nothing to try and be her. And how is that going to not be a problem for her devotions, or a bound relationship or survival relationship? How are these things going to exist without the necessity to collapse them? You know, bounding a man to her and her to a man, well, it's quite a tall order when you consider the collapsing of dimensions, because giving the liberty to know the truth, or giving the possibility to see in a dimension safely, is very much relative to the concern of the necessity to collapse that entire dimension. Maybe her last navigated reality, maybe something that nobody will ever prove or know she expires during. Who's ever really going to know the circumstances under which those realities are really protected or cared for? How much is the reality? You know, as I sit here, it's an indefinitely valuable question. It's an indefinitely valuable possibility. It's an indefinitely near to necessary for survival forever's concern. But I'm clearly not waking up every day expecting every person in the world to care about that or feel about that. I'm certainly not probably trying to create excuses by which everyone in the world is surrendering their safety of mind to think about it or talk about it in conditions that aren't perfect for them to consider or talk about it. And I clearly have to create things to look at problem states of all sorts and types in proportion to those types of considerations and concerns. Matter of fact, I have to create things to look at those considerations and concerns whether the liberty is given to her or it isn't. From a survival standpoint. It's quite a tall order to create liberty for bound reality. And maybe you imagine this is a world that several have experienced a indescribable relationship to destiny and divide and divinity, myself, places, the truth, experience, and in no clear relationship are those experiences evidencing control over these decisions. Quite a perplexing possibility. Quite a perplexing concern that things that anybody isn't valuing as I sit here, things that anybody isn't prioritizing in proportion to forever, and things that maybe isn't being reconciled in proportion to the he and she forever. And they're going to look at their experience to divides and divinity and destiny and somehow balance themselves to have the right answer for these pressures. I don't think that's going to be happening. I don't know who would ever have tried to convince anybody. I wouldn't have worried about that tremendously forever. You know, God didn't expect there to be incredible problem potentials in proportion to he and she's reality at some incomparable perplexing variable state to all other things existing with the world or elsewhere in space. God clearly didn't expect there to be problems there, huh? But it's almost irreconcilable to try and make sense of it. Maybe it's simpler in possibility from respects of the boulder. Things that are strength possibilities that aren't simply or easily placeable in proportion to respects about time or God or everybody, and yet there are clearly knowings of time, but it maybe isn't very clear how those knowings relate to these pressures throughout time. And it's just a never-ending problem again. Because why I'll design survival necessity and stick by it, support it, protect it, defend it, live with it, repeat it, devote to be a part of a series or sequence or a relationship or a growth or a generation, why I'll subscribe to a Lord or to God or to all time, why I will do these things, and my concerns of surviving in BouND are clearly very, very different and going to be different than anything that finds the proper reason to feel at the proper time because of cyclical knowledge at some proportion to destiny or at some proportion to survival. It's clearly very, very, very different mentalities or modus fixationables, sensation. It's clearly very perplexing to try and reconcile, not to mention to think about. What I know is just delicious. It's just delicious. Because what it amounts to is, if there's something that needs to take place now, what I know is marbling into an excuse to invest, to undermine why I agree with myself about vitality. And, for instance, liberties that have been afforded to her might not be consistent over time in proportion to altruistic investment to try and answer questions before their time, to try and have relationships to sensuality before necessary course maneuvers are ever addressed or discovered in proportion to evidences of actual investments. And what type of dualities of mind doesn't need to be in place, Someday, for instance, her altitude is going to be feeling a pressure near to these concerns at a real ratio to directing time utility. And instead of having a centered self navigating the pressure as a liver, there she'll be saying to herself, well, in this state of definitive, I am on point with necessity bound frequencies, and I am performing at a such and such relationship. But if I was answering questions in another frequency about thinking about these questions at some performant distance from how I ever agree with myself, well, then I might start making these comparisons. I might leave a legacy about these comparisons. Who knows what type of vantageable, constructible gravities I'll ever create or in the future as a new self depend on at some distance from valuing survival from where I have ever valued it. Anyway, you get these divides of centered self clearly on some crash course to create distances between family and dependency and commitment and trust in time. Anyway, what I think clearly becomes very delicious in proportion to the rate a dimension collapses. And maybe there's things floating around memory somewhere to the tune of, well, whether I agree with myself or I'm always right, I'm clearly not the only survivor in space that might ever impact what happens when or if. And it's going to be the most delicious thing of all, because if I'm to care about these disconnects, if I'm to care about comparing them, if I'm to care about species existing, or different existences existing, or multiplicities of survival statuses existing in tandem to one another, if I'm to care about these things, it's not simple for me to distance the vision of the problem from the complexities of the ever-emergent problem status that is maybe attempting to fixate on answers or data before it's time, or in realities that it shouldn't be in time. And when you know that, any environment, any place, any dimension, whether it's designed in real time or it's designed for minds of the future 100, 1,000, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000 years ahead of time, there's a whole lot of behavior that is collapsing onto knowns that aren't dying. There's a whole lot of behavior that is collapsing onto things like pathetic or disappointment or embarrassment or neglect or war or invasive realities in proportion to time. It isn't impossible to pinpoint problems in proportion to a dimension or an environment where the problems are complicating any number of these graceful flow dynamics. It isn't impossible to pinpoint that. And, I'm going to sit you for 1,000,000 years somewhere, or less, and you're either going to convince me that you're safe to survive with, or you're going to convince me that you aren't safe to survive with. You aren't going to have any choice in the matter of whether or not I'm successful to protect the grace of how I bound landscapes. You're not going to have any choice in the matter to change how I pinpoint things that occur in proportion to those definitions. You aren't going to have the choice. And dimensions are clearly going to collapse in proportion to choices about those knowns. In fact, maybe it isn't clear what might ever attempt to collapse dimensions for fear maybe that relationships would be good. And maybe for fear that relationships would be good for survival. Maybe it isn't completely impossible to imagine the success of God maybe is a fear somewhere in time in proportion to dimensions of fixating energy. And when you look at it from bounding landscapes or environments near to these caring possibilities, you might realize paying to care consistently isn't always right. It isn't on its way to being always right. And anybody that maybe has the liberty to care, well, they're not as high on the spectrum as I am today, and they're certainly not as high as any liberty that would be given to a she in a bound of her and he. And any number of necessities need to happen before any of those liberters, maybe they care as much as anybody, but they're kind of on loan, because what's paying for the continual care isn't them. It's a sequence of certainty in proportion to necessity and bound and trajectory. And we just aren't clipsed the point by which their caring is paid for. You see, if their caring was paid for, there'd be room for dimensional problems in proportion to these certainties of always being right about places God has to make decisions, in proportion to it isn't ever going to fail, in proportion to things that clearly need answers before their time. So they're very peculiar care factor possibilities in proportion to these statuses of time, of concentration, and of knowing. For instance, I look at the universe and I say, this conversation, whatever it means to anything, if it were ever in the hands of anything, well, one thing's for sure, it's massively expensive, it's massively heavy, and where it's happening, well, there's probably going to be more focus of right grace investment than most any other type of conversation that is ever happening in space. So, if that's ever going to happen, and it's maybe allotted for in proportion to survival-bound necessity, well, there's a lot of truth, and there's a lot of knowns, and there's a lot of reasoning, and there's a lot of safeties, and there's clearly a lot of potential that exists in a dynamic of those relationships. Why anybody can continuously care, it's maybe as simple as you can't reach up to the dynamic and say, now I'm going to care continuously. But maybe if you can care continuously, it has something to do with the efficiency of the dynamics to be serving a survival status in some definition in proportion to godly decision, in proportion to space-time. It might be that simple, but I'm clearly not explaining or even focusing on all of the possibilities of good or bad or frequency or relationship or surviving or problems that have or ever could or might ever occur, because it's just that simple. You see, God, at any point in time, maybe there's a want to explain pressure, or there's a want to explain, look, I created this way, but I'd really like to tell you about it, but even if I could tell you, types of things. It isn't simple for you to look at the world and yourself and say, once again, there was a lot of consideration in proportion to maintaining survival, maintaining devotions and centered mindedness, maintaining development in mass and logic bases. And it's clearly been crashing into the question of, is it any definition of appropriate time for awareness of the appreciation to either be developing or sustaining or concentrating or in tandem, whether to myself or to the undying concerns of development of space-time that aren't dying. They aren't ever going to die. They're never going to die because they're created in some mix of relationship to always right that isn't touched, that isn't stopping from the ever-flowing, is always going to be a concern. Thus, it is always going to be a factor of perplexing dimensions of variable. Is always going to be a factor in this or that other thing. But that's what I'm saying. Altruist vantage of these priorities, they aren't creating all space. They're existing in a known relationship to anybody ever that ever needs to survive. It's clearly maybe limitless numbers of definitions of these types of things. It isn't simple to just say, well, you know, these concerns are formatting at a pressure that, no, it's these people that are controlling the outcomes, or these people that are seeing the investments of the all true versus the always right. No, it's their ball game. Isn't that simple? And that's just it. A dimension is going to collapse in proportion to these knowns because they're going to try and suffocate something with their asshole because they aren't flying the universe. And these assholes are distinctly findable in direct proportion to the value of these variables, and always have been. Because defining pressure vision ahead of development, or ahead of awareness, or ahead of reality, or ahead of existence, or ahead of life, these aren't impossible statuses of vacuum to create, and they're certainly statuses that have been employed in proportion to any number of environments. You know, it isn't simple for anybody of this or any other environment to beat me to the value of the moment in vacuum definition. I'm one of the oldest knowns of survival of the planet. As I sit, live, and breathe, these knowns aren't dying where they're known. They aren't going to die where they're known. And it's impossibly difficult for any awareness of the time to value that, to respect the reality, or even respect any amount of the pressure of it. See, you try and put that burden on somebody from a distance, or even a locality. It isn't simple, because they maybe there's any number of knowns. They are or aren't a risk to whatever, however it's defined. Any number of definitions. They does or doesn't try and touch any number of things. They does or doesn't try and create or ignite or insinuate any number of types of things. It goes on and 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 on. It's all very critical in proportion to something like, well, as I know what I'm concentrating on, and I know what type of pressure realities might ever erupt from such knowings, and what type of survival vitalities might ever relate to such, quote, balances. Somebody else maybe didn't create this reality. They maybe didn't define all the necessity. They maybe doesn't respect any specific particular. But maybe they're clearly surviving too. Maybe they have responsible ethics. Maybe they have survival interests. Maybe they have a self, you know. But there's any number of things. It isn't simple to say, well, their existence is or isn't good for the universe. It isn't simple to say that. You see, because A, what makes it possible for this reality to occur? Well, that's maybe the most damning subject of all of it. You know, somebody's going to have a comfort. I've just walked them to a liberation, or I've just walked them to a faith, or I've just walked them to a ground. Okay? But where is that comfort coming from? It's coming from maybe the most dense, damning anticipations of time. You know, I maybe know myself. You and I look at each other here and now. Passivity isn't going to be getting created. Argument is going to get created. Pressure is going to get created. Imbalances of certainty are going to get created. Whatever pressures are continuing and looming and necessary and vital, they aren't being respected. Not only that, but we're going to be creating imbalances. Probably. It isn't very dependable. We're going to look at each other right here and now, and we isn't creating anything. We isn't creating whatever type of anything to get here. See? Any number of altruistic things are what to that possibility? And I got to study it in every language, in every dimension, in every approach to that concentration. I got to study it forever. See? But where those knowns are going, there's a relationship to that going and the stability of every survival plane there is. There's a relationship. There's a relationship to any word that tries to get in the middle of it. There's a relationship to any course that tries to be bigger than it. There's a relationship to any type of grasp of energy that ever tries to, like, you know, I needed to be there with this amount of altruism because I wasn't just trying to shove my asshole around the security of vacuums to create death anywhere I see fit in proportion to not being responsible for any of the creations, because I'm never looking you in the eyes here and now. I was never doing it. Versus, I would never stand for it. I would never let it continue, and I would collapse the motherfucking dimension that ever tries to accomplish it. Ultimately, I just collapse it. It no longer exists. Whatever was inside it is now space dust. And that's maybe one way to address the possibility of continuing. You know, because somewhere along the line, somebody needs to continue. And somewhere along the line, somebody else is either going to accept that or create problems because of it. It's maybe one way to solve the possibilities, collapsing the motherfucking dimension. But that's also what I'm saying. It's because where those types of concerns aren't maybe simply in anybody's hands at any number of realities, it's clearly a subject that is maybe, you know, it's maybe seen as creating problems, or it isn't creating passivity. Who knows how anybody else might try and navigate these awarenesses, right? How they might try and make it better or best or perfect for the balances of whoever. That's the point. How many perfect balances near this conversation at these altitudes do you think are happening around the planet so that he and she is just an ever-escaping mystery of no responsibility to ever protect he and she? No responsibility to ever be able to provide for the care of he or she. because of whatever these things might be, creating energy near to he and she, and how obvious it is to see near to he and she in forever. And before these types of questions are answered, I mean, you're looking at a lot of whiplash. You're looking at a lot of disrespect of why creation, or disrespect of why alternative environments, or disrespect of why future safety is ever able to be depended on in realities and relationships. But it's a lot of whiplash, because maybe who knows how many forces that value the future that aren't protecting any of the necessity that is getting them there. That's maybe what I see every day when I look at me, and I look at maybe the oldest known of the creation of the planet, and I look at every other thing touching any number of things. They're getting to that future without the necessity that's getting them there. You know, so you've never had a relationship to this moment, or these necessities of defining care, and yet you've looked at caring about the future without necessity X amount of times. Should you ever be able to cast a decision above the relationships of this conversation? Or would you just neglect to ever answer that in the face of everybody, because you're out? That's how you're playing everybody as if you were God. That's how your duality of centered mind is going to get you off the hook for all the relationships you're ever going to need to have to all these things that are clearly creating catastrophe for your perfect butt fucking. And you clearly didn't make it very far without the idiot who thought about it. Who knows how many things didn't ever come into existence before somebody cared enough to think about it. But on a planet like this, at a time like this, well, you clearly couldn't even begin to answer that question. There's an idea. You're getting to a future without necessity, and you don't even know half of what there is to know about the things that have come into existence because of this conversation. So sure that your destiny, with or without something, is just this. Well, it's something's tampon, that's for sure. Anyway, the separation of gold from hitting Mach 7 to 48, the concept of placing value on the separation of gold through duration impenetrably, where's that coming from? It's coming from a back pressure of impossibility for anybody that looks at necessity depreciation being unable to touch this conversation in any number of respects by God. Thus, any amount of gold separation is clearly hanging in a limbo that is already expecting there to be no prescribing authority to correct what doesn't need corrected, and some sort of, who knows what type of pressure-bound relationship is the other problem. These expectations and these creations of things that doesn't really need to be explained in proportion to that type of assumption, that it's once again, it's creating byproducts of not being able to value necessity. and what types of forecasts of thought are concluded, because, you know, there's a vector. All the separated gold existing in proportion of these perplexities because of knowns of impossibility right next to myself. And it isn't outside of my vision to see. It isn't outside of God to know about. But where the thinking is headed, and where the dimensions of miscellaneous are projecting or traversing, you know, sort of tandem to where the thought is headed, there are an infinite amount of golds or infinite amount of thinkers that can project what that is producing in proportion to any number of streams of time. Anyway, it clearly isn't going to be, or ever has been, ideal for a momentum of such precision to be followed by problem statuses in the separation of divides of gold in, around, among, or beneath survival plane necessity definitions. It clearly isn't ideal for there to be problems there because a lot of reasons, but if there's going to be reconciliation such as, like, we relate to gold and we're moving it through time, and thinking is surviving and it's clearly headed somewhere through time, there's clearly going to be statuses of, quote, reconciliation in proportion to all types of things, such as, like, all time, such as, like, all memory, such as, like, all bounds of relationship, tangibles, so on and so forth. And yet, maybe nothing is prepared in the always right department to need to tolerate a large amount of knowing of those velocities, you know. I got the gold separated. It thinks nobody's going to be able to rectify anything that it's projecting near to these times, but, like, it's dead wrong. But it doesn't, it's not like the cutting, like, it's not going to reshape everybody's spirit there. It's not going to reshape everybody's prerogative, but, like, maybe there's concession, maybe there's, like, tolerance, maybe there's, like, alright, but, like, it isn't going to, like, cut, and, like, they're headed, like, you know, it might be fine that there isn't, like, a whole lot of knowledge about that, because, like, you know, it's just going to be more eruption and more contagion bound of, you know, trying to be delicious and trying to redefine senses of self before necessary or things about survival have been met or things about time have been met. Anyway, it's a big face-fucking potential in proportion to creation. It's a big face-fucking potential in proportion to, like, you know, he and she is maybe sort of accounted for, in truth, in proportion to these realities in time, and not to mention any number of survivals or existences or relationships. There's going to be a lot of things that are potentially coming or on their way to going into focus in proportion to, you know, maybe, who knows what's going to be there. But there's definitely a lot of definition in proportion to a lot of pressure, you know, and, like, it definitely isn't going to be, it certainly isn't ideal for these monuments of possibility to be followed by, you know, problems along these concentrations. You know, half of the material I've gone over in the past 12 months, I mean, any number of things, a limited number of things, if we could assume vacuum of the world is a solid status in respects of data transmission and awareness, even the local region, right? It's all this banking and telemetry of concept concentration, clearly devoid of this conversation in most every respect, but you know, you're going to march up to these ideas trumping up design as if it's necessary. That's the gold. That's the real gold. Because no amount of design is creating always right. No amount of design is creating, I see you coming with your design. You know, I doesn't need anybody else really probably ever to make this conversation in any number of lights. I mean, maybe someday it'll happen. But like, that isn't creating passivity either. That isn't creating answers for any number of stabilities. But what I'm saying is that if we could depend on some sort of vacuum, I mean, like what I've gone over the past 12 months, a number of forces already know that, like, in nobody's hands is half of that material opening doors. But like, nobody maybe knows how that's valued. Nobody maybe knows how that's framed in consistency. I mean, in the next billion years, half the doors are going to remain closed to a year like this. That's maybe par in a billion years over duration. You know, it's impossible to frame scenario value when you expand next to concepts you doesn't ever respect in any number of relationships. You know, when you're going to collapse a dimension in proportion to problems of these concentrations, how excited are you to let the ever consistent attempts to bridge linkages of specificity just because something exists? How rambunctious are you on your way to letting yourself tolerate? You know, you're just going to let them be. It isn't going to bother you. You aren't going to be worried about it, and you're just going to let it happen, whatever it is. Whatever they're developing, whatever they're building, whatever they're compiling, whatever they're stringing or slewing or slaughtering. You know, it was in your hands, but, you know, it wasn't that interesting to worry about. It was in your hands, but they're about the dumbest things that could ever be built to be dumb. Because you're down to your out asshole and can't get past the altruistic, and you're hovering there because you're treading water near the impossibility of them ever being able to remember, you know. You're just letting them be artificial. Oh, and you're trying to do it, paying for it on all the devices and designs that prioritize artificial least. And you're trying to accomplish it by collapsing dimensions you didn't create. For instance, how impossible is it to teach somebody ethic to work on governing apparatus in this discussion? As in, you would ever be able to cite the pressure of this discussion to teach ethic. How impossible is that? How impossible should it be at proportions of realities. How impossible should it be from one dimension of tangibility to another dimension of satiability, to another dimension where priorities are held, to another dimension where acuity is distant? How much, how much, how much? How many eyes do you need to trust to ever wait 1 billion years to know it for yourself or for anybody? How heavy are all these questions? What are the most important variables, huh? What are the variables that need to survive the most certain, huh? What are the things somebody is going to lie the most about, as if they hold the answers? How much might everybody need always right because somebody's eyes and yet maybe none of them can ever touch it or prove their relationship to it? You know, there's a question you might see. Me talking, me speaking, me knowing is a clearly different energy. Very difficult to respect in some tangible proportion to I put it on God, or I put it on the day, or I put it on the energy, or I put it on myself. You know, the next thing you know, everybody's surviving with a history they didn't pay anything for their body and their God. All of them. How artificial is that? Meanwhile, you're sitting somewhere and you know that dimension might collapse on you. How could that be possible? You could be somewhere caring about he and she. Your dimension might collapse on you, and all these artificial statuses are just going to outlive you, going to outsurvive you, going to outperform you. Why is that going to be possible? And you get all these separations of gold. It's the only question they ever need. Anyway, every single decision about a planet that's been built at a distance is sort of living on the lie that any of them have lived through this moment, because none of them are asking or are on their way to asking, nor is it ever going to matter by the time they do ask. Once you've lived, is there anything good coming from the knowing? Is there anything good coming from the experience? And how can you make a decision for a planet before you've lived that? When you know you can't make a decision for a planet before anybody has lived that, and yet look at all these decisions. It's a different picture. It's a different problem. It's a different fallout. Because there's maybe no good reason why any of them are on their way to getting anywhere. Because anything that's propelling them hasn't answered the question either. Anything that's propelling them maybe hasn't cared about the question. And anything that's propelling them maybe isn't investing to protect the question. I isn't waiting for all the gold in the universe to pay for the protection of the question. I'm going to collapse the dimensions that attack the protection of the question. Because if I doesn't, somebody else is going to try inventing God. Somebody else is going to try inventing a path for survival. Now, I didn't say that there aren't more than one paths for survival, but you might believe if I wasn't collapsing dimensions in proportion to the protection of that question, well, the survival picture of this planet would be drastically different. Maybe I should include, if I wasn't prepared to collapse dimensions, especially in proportion to these concentrates, the same thing. The survival picture of this planet would be tremendously different. That is to say, maybe there's dimensions I haven't collapsed yet. I'll throw another statistic at you. You look at this conversation, and then you wonder, is there any guarantee, even if they were knowledged, minds ready, potentially capable to entertain concepts and ideas, would this discussion even register with them? Would it even mean anything? Would it make any difference or impact on their awareness or thinking? You know, you see the failure of survival in a bubble in an instant, and forces of necessity at maybe the most sharp necessity you're ever going to realize. God is there. But does the conversation, does it even make any difference? Is there any awareness residue? Is there any thinking happening? It's a statistic. What's it take for that relationship to be possible? What's it take for that relationship to have a chance? What's it take for that relationship to actually be occurring in some reality where those questions are somewhat answered? No, there isn't any thinking that is happening. Or, yeah, there is. I don't see you planning 1 billion years without investing in the answers to that question. I don't see you being comfortable or confident knowing that you were storing information under lower priorities than the conversation to begin with, and praying that the conversation at the tail is something that's being paid for the future condensing of relationships beyond or above any amount of governance, or beyond or above any amount of decision, or beyond or above any amount of speculation. What's paying for the comfort to care? If it isn't prayer, well, you're selling everything. That's exactly what it is. You aren't going to look me in the face. You're going to look at me and me look at you, and we're creating passivity. Probably isn't going to happen. We're probably going to create some sort of energy, even by the simple knowing of these types of concentrates, that it just isn't any number of things that are desired by any number of knowns. I didn't say nobodies. That's possible too. I didn't say nothings. Maybe that's even more possible. But by any number of knowns. You know, you look at a question like that. How much are you really going to tolerate somebody trying to eat your potato? You think God's going to let you eat the potato because it's more important than these questions becoming answered? I don't think so. And I don't know who's going to tell you that God has a choice in the matter. God doesn't have a choice in the matter. But if God doesn't have a choice in the matter, that just makes it all the more obvious who definitely doesn't have a choice in the matter. It's not like there's somebody else that has more of a choice in the matter. And there's maybe a lot of ways to value God doesn't have a choice in the matter. That's the other problem. Because maybe you'd think, well, there's a lot of relationships that God's choice, maybe it isn't obvious, is weighing in on the relationship, and maybe that'd be a critical piece of information to be sharing. Who knows what types of connections might become dependable because of such sharings? You might realize any dimension where that is a precept of concentratable value, the dimension clearly needs defined, separate than a lot of gold. As you approach no way to explain creation. That's seriously what you're approaching. No way to explain creation. But there's one you can genuinely expect nobody to appreciate what that means or why it maybe fits in this discussion. Maybe expect a lot of collapsing dimensions or severings occurring in proportion to that concentrate. And that's clearly quite a riddle too, because of all the places somebody's going to look for severing of connection in proportion to divinity or God or concepts of the ultimate, well, they're probably going to be looking there rather sharply very quickly, aren't they? And with any amount of perception out of the mix, any amount of, somebody would try and look there sharply and define excuses to create necessary participants to survive always right pressures just long enough to, take possession of something. And how many governments wouldn't like to have a reigning champion of artifice to handle those pressures for them so that they can continue caring without you in time? How nice would that be? Oh, well, if you could just get your asshole around it, you could fool everybody. Even God. You could fool them all. You could effectively write everything you see out of existence, whether everything's paid for it to survive or it isn't. You can imagine the type of shit somebody would try and build over the potato. Any type of government you can imagine, any type of facility of networking you can imagine being connected to a portal of any center from any distance. Oh yeah. You can probably even imagine, without even being able to feel it or touch it or even see it, you can probably imagine somebody might try and create an awful lot of shit above the potato. And it's like ridiculous to invite you to think about it. Because like I just said, what are you going to do? You're going to try and get yourself to be valued for looking at the problem dimension in any definition just long enough for you to take possession of something. I don't know if you're going to realize how much sense that doesn't make for God to ever do for your sake in this discussion, because you probably aren't ever going to have the sense of mind to realize how the hell did you ever survive hearing this conversation at all? How the hell did you survive to even hear it? You get possibility for a lot of inadequacy or possibility for always right investment. It's much more survival when you're a party to very sensitive information. You're thankful for something. You respect something. You realize there are forces that are bigger than your control at work. It isn't simple at all, because you're probably the last person that is going to fix what is happening that's a part of your survival. It's just so big. It's just so powerful. It's just so mighty. I can't explain it, but I know there's a relationship to why I'm a part of it. It's just this like euphoria, right? It isn't simple, because you're probably the last person to kick whatever it is in the nuts, whatever it could be. You're probably the last person that's going to stand up and be like, there's all this powerful energy, and there's clearly a lot of possible excuses, but like, guess what? I've got it all figured out, why there's holes in all these places, why there's rules being broken, and all these things, and why any number of dimensions just needs to be severed or collapsed. Probably the last thing that's going to be doing that. It's not simple. It isn't simple at all. Because you aren't going to look at me and we're creating passivity. Oh no. Not here. No way. But it's precisely what a pressure like this needs. They'd say, well, since it needs passivity, or altruism will be perfect, impregnating the reality. Say, how could these things be possible? You know, when you realize the speed, I've come to see the possibility. Ahead of the development of any place that feels it in an environment, there's only so many reasons why it was let to be possible. But what you might want to take another look at is, if there's only so many reasons it could be let to be possible, how many forces can stand up and kick the pressure in the nuts? Because if he doesn't have an answer, you aren't stopping the boulder. You might realize the answer, where it's known, isn't going to be known in an altruism. It's going to be known by a limit in proportion to limiter theory and limiter gravity knowledge. Because it isn't like we're just going to stop the world from turning. It isn't like we're just going to do something that corrects the course and then just like puts everything on our plate. If the answers have answers, they have limited possibilities associated with the answers. They have limited gravities of knowing and receivership that are associated with them, and it's clearly all in proportion to never-ending flows of always right. So there's only so much anybody's going to gather from being relevant to those formations of concentration. And a tandem is going to be always right, maybe getting a lot more of data in proportion to a lot more peculiarity of necessity that's neglected and disrespected. And it's, you know, nobody's going to be taking that divide and respecting it to care about it, and care about it with the provisions that make these moments priorities of necessity at a direct value. You see, you know, God has been desecration versus actual survival course. You know, somewhere somebody needs to care that can't be these things. Somebody needs to care that doesn't live this life. But like, there's clearly what is desecration, what isn't, what is actual survival, what are, I mean, whether there's actual truth about those concerns at any point in time maybe isn't real clear that they belong today. Maybe isn't real clear that anybody needs to be worried about much of that in any number of lights, but it's all in the weight of the isn't creating passivity. I can't put those ideas in your hands and force you to remember you isn't creating passivity. Quote. Because when I put those ideas in your hands, passivity isn't the obstacle, you see, but it is. But you aren't going to look at that forever and be always right about it. You aren't going to look at it forever and remove the assumption from the knowledge in every person that exists. You aren't going to physically do that and sever and collapse dimensions based on it. So we're going to try and associate the questions of the divide toward a utility or toward a merit or toward an activity or toward a norm, we steward, we govern, we hold, we whatever, they're all acuities in proportion to a modus of utility. They aren't reflecting on zero passivity, and they aren't on their way to. Thus, they aren't going to collapse the dimensions of the concern. They aren't going to solve forever problems that ever come from those priorities being shaken or shifted or even touched. See, navigable priority, like, once again, from the moment I say the words, anything that hears it is maybe instantly an experiment, because they're instantly severed from dimensions of knowing those priorities. Something is going to sit there and wait while something presumes it's the responsible party to the definitions, and it's going to be what? God's just going to let that be a ghost of all time sitting back in the middle of that vortex of desecration? I don't think so. Wandering around till always right collapses the dimension because no one else is going to solve it because they're Nimrods? I don't think so. But that's the point. I mention these things, but maybe it isn't clear that now is the time to be focused on desecration and things along those lines. And, I mean, there's clearly inversion reasons of that also in proportion to the obviousness of considering who's talking at this point in time. But, like, why you feel the idea or the concept, something would feel it. Clearly, once the utility begins getting engaged with, from the moment the words are received in a context at these types of specificities, you're looking at all time being pushed by the assumption there is wise maneuvering of the utility in a momentum. Whether it's about one body or one orbit or one hand or one generation or one moment or every moment in the future. It isn't passive, but it isn't an invitation to excuse passive assumption or study. It's just, you see, you aren't built to respect the passivity reflection at this pressure, and maybe nothing ever really needs to be built to respect it at an obviousness of the pressure. What is learning? What is hearing the concern? Okay. I can't forget these questions as always right. And I isn't interested in inviting anybody to redefine it for me. But you understand there's a genuine difference between the concern of the reflection being there and it not being there. You just have the hardest obstacle to ever convince yourself why it's a vital known that isn't forever displaced by the strategy or the forever tolerances of such possibility. You know, I could abstain from needing to do anything with the utility of those conclusions. For instance, quote, I isn't going to let it drive my weekend. I isn't going to let it create a ghost and some waiting to describe me as an experiment out the door. I isn't going to do that. Well, I have to know. It's infinitely different than wandering off as if it's all your energy. It's infinitely different than, pressurizing something as if. Because there's an infinite number of things you aren't going to be touching as you maneuver along those questions. Infinite. But the point is, you can't give away an example of why desecration is maybe incredibly more concentratively problematic than any sense of commune or planet or singular or safe or solved or perfect that you've maybe ever had the opportunity to imagine or contemplate. And what's going to happen to your contemplations if you're ever concerned with how specifically problematic desecration ever is? What's going to happen to all those concentrations? Are they going to be more powerful than the limits that are necessary in proportion to survival of this conversation? Why would that ever be possible? Would it be peculiar in proportion to always right? Because, maybe you does discover something. Maybe you realize something. Maybe you find something specific that could be, maybe real good for surviving. Is it peculiar? Would you need somebody to be there to, think about it someday that maybe has some sort of track record caring about these peculiarities that maybe ever... Why would you ever be valued to have those experiences at all? Why would something exist that's capable of valuing you to think about that? Or do people just think about things anywhere they can or want, and it doesn't matter? There isn't any say-so. There isn't any issue that anybody ever needs to be respectful or protective of in proportion to how volatile concentrations might ever produce absences of passivity in proportion to what is the forever history of he and she. So 2 hours of concepts and sound and time. You think it's all just put together with a stamp of whatever over everybody's heads and just says, go fuck yourselves? Or things have known the things they've been doing before, and when they work on limits and survival and possibility, there's maybe much more concern and logic and attention that goes into that than maybe any number of things ever take the time to wonder about or to care about, or to maybe they hasn't developed themselves to feel it the best. How good could that conclusion be? How much do you have to give away of yourself or anybody else whenever, maybe you just didn't develop to feel it the best? You ever study that forever? All those reasons why you build weapons, well, it's because your answers that you meet in space aren't going to be very reciprocal in proportion to that question, isn't it? You can't take and march your legion into space and everybody focus on that question and everybody in the middle find out on both ends they're not getting the same information. And they aren't going to trust each other to get the same information, and they're building everything to prioritize that meaning at the inverse of those conclusions. They're literally building it all. What happens to a good idea of a good answer in a unity because of an all-true theory, or because of an all-true exercise, or because of something within a penumbra of toleration that isn't prioritizing the survival of either side, but finds itself in the middle, prioritizing survival in the middle. See, somebody that builds weapons probably couldn't keep their fucking hands off what would ever seem like a middle in some sort of dispute of creating weapons in proportion to, altruism. What type of conclusions of rapture of, I just didn't develop to feel that well about these concepts. I didn't invest the best. You think I want to invest always right to get to sit back and just have to sift through all that calamity? Anytime there's a prioritied pressure happening, it's just going to be somebody else's war vantage on marching a legion into space. That's why all the legions are far, far, far beneath all these questions. That ball balance ain't hiding shit. But you'd probably, maybe I wouldn't say you're recklessly endangering everybody to look at everybody and know that they're useless to those knowledges, or like look at everybody and see how they're useless to any number of trajectory necessities near to those knowledges, but like something might value you as a reckless endangerer because of anything you might do with those conclusions. Something might. I myself might value as one possibly, but like maybe I wouldn't. Maybe I wouldn't. Just as an example. I'm not saying myself personally, but like, it's certainly clearly not outside of the bounds of possibility. I'm just saying. Someday, you're going to look at your life and say, of all the things I could have handled, or all the things I could have valued, or all the weapons or machines or interesting things I could have stepped on to achieve what you have today or what you see yourself as today, one day you were in a place and none of that stuff really dictated any of the necessity pressure that knowing did. Maybe it wasn't the weapons that landed you a seat to hear these things, and if it did, wouldn't that be something to look at? Because why do I want to invest always right to have to deal with that calamity? You see how many things are at stake when it comes to the future and values, and vacuum, seeing points that provide the Cair possibilities on trajectories and time, the air we're breathing, literally the light we have left to see because our dimension hasn't collapsed. War consideration is definitely important, and some of these questions I brought up are definitely a big staple in the diet of processing in proportion to what is good enough to feel in a logic or in a real relationship to tangible concentration or concern. There's clearly a lot of time, strategy, knowing, investment, safety, and maneuvering and logistic that's involved in all these concerns, but as important as it is, somewhere you got to be able to realize that, like, you got to have the time to live first. And if he doesn't have the time to live, he definitely doesn't have time to go to war. See, but that's what we're looking at. We're looking at anything of space or of our own creation or our own families, attempting to try and prove to itself that the room to live has come before me, and it didn't. And that vision isn't in any number of creators' hands. That vision isn't any number of places' investments. There are very specific knowings that would ever survive valuing that and surviving to value that. And any number of them still aren't touching the flows. And whether you like it or you doesn't like it, if that is possible to exist with a truth and a righteousness and a survival priority that isn't off-putting any number of planets or God or possibility where these things are known and tested and true, well, that's quite a possibility. And it's certainly a heavy investment. And it's certainly the type of thing that, you know, any number of things, as they come and go and age and exist, they aren't going to touch. Just as I'm one of the oldest existing knowns of the planet, that possibility is right up there with it. Here's an example of a peculiar variable dimension and always right. Because any number of things aren't touching, like, okay, there's probably a billion numbers of forces that nobody has ever seen, touched, or created that exist because of our ancestors. A billion of them, they have awkward relationships that are undefined by anybody to myself. Nobody knows how to define them, nobody's seen them, nobody's touched them. Always Right has some knowledge of this, whatever it is. And then you get this divide of that possibility of placing the time to live lesser in a war strategy. Always Right has knowns about that too. But you might find it peculiar because God wouldn't ever let anybody hold both of those knowns. Meaning, as the data exists in that divide, there's knowns about it. But in that definition, Always Right maybe doesn't tolerate anybody knowing the knowns. It's so freaking peculiar. I don't expect anybody to get that. I'll give you an example. Hi, I'm God. I'm going to define some limits in proportion to so freaking peculiar. Moral of the story is, not even I could touch those knowns today. They're so freaking peculiar. That's the way I designed it. Because it has to be impossible for anybody to touch those knowns today. Literally. Because it has to be always valued as so freaking peculiar. It has to be always valued that way, truly, in any number of dimensional relationships that none of the dimensions can control the truth of the flow. Because it's right up there with passivity of forever definitions of passivity. A flow could be passive without any mutinized exchange or any war happening in the interface. Where those things are valued and true, the passivity is clearly defined in proportion to that impossibility. Nobody could be in the middle of that, touching it, holding it. And any time those types of peculiarities ever come together at concentration, it's maybe the same story. Nobody can be there handling it, knowing it, or drawing on it at any point in time. Because that thing has to remain forever true in a knowing it always right. It's like the type of altitude possibility could create because enough has been answered, enough has been stabilized, enough has been ensured. But like, if there's a problem, it's like an immediate collapse, because it would uninsure any number of things that are created, any number of things that are already exist in stabilities. If you imagine all the registers of data that see and know pressure, any number of them maybe have tangible relationships to somebody, but there's any number that doesn't have any access. There isn't any fucking touch. There isn't any draw. There isn't any control. It's designed that way, where the knowns are known. They aren't tandem. They're in their own defined, knowledgeable flows. They go where they go. They pack it how they're packing it. And when there are relationships of that data, there's relationships of that data. But if you imagine all that stacked together, it's not that it makes sense because of the possibility or the peculiarity of so freaking peculiar. But without the lynch of the impossibilities, however they're defined in proportion to it, it wouldn't mesh. It wouldn't. You just have problems. Nobody needs those problems. But there's an example. Of always right. Because always right can keep the lid on the collapsing, and it can also remember why. And it can do it without any persuasion of investment to the contrary of survival plane definition. That's the point. If not even I could handle that divide of knowns, then maybe it's impossible for anybody ever to stand there and create things in the middle of those knowns, aside from an evidence of the history of the survival plane within limits of definition that ever created the possibility of the impossibility. There may be no other vitality ever served for anything to stand there in any other light, and it probably definitely wouldn't be tolerated for anybody to be there today. Because any number of things that are held together, it's just one more reality they doesn't ever need to climb to fix. It doesn't need to war to overcome. It doesn't need to fight with God about the perfection of. Just one more thing. It'd be quite a possibility if anyone was ever let to study how that conclusion was ever reached, or how a design of such a priority ever came to be a priority. But it's definitely up there in designer history of the highest variety. Whether it required the most sophisticated designers to instill, or it didn't, maybe isn't really the most important question. How to keep a lid on the knowing, and without wrecking any... I could keep a lid on the knowing without preferring any type of survivor. As in, me and you know it. She and he. They both know the ideas. They've seen the possibility. They maybe believe it's relative to a pressure, and maybe it actually is very relative. I could keep a lid on he and she that know it without a preference of what they're designed as.
what they're consisting of, how many molecules they have inside their heads. I could prioritize keeping a lid on it without any of it. I clearly need to base it on something. And just because I keep a lid on it doesn't mean they have any type of value added to their quality of anything. You know, I could keep a lid on you. It doesn't manifest you into a frog or like a magician. Just because I keep a lid on you doesn't give you powers, for instance. But I keep a lid on you. I mean, it's just going to get attacked. Somebody's going to want the lid definition to work. They want to be, you know, they want to get close enough to stand somewhere that where the lid gets put on them so they can see what the lid is. They can define the lid, and they know what the obstacle is for what the lid protects, and then they can go to bat with some all true, and it's just going to be whatever it's going to become. But that's why you keep a lid on. So here's an example. If not even God could stand in the middle and hold that divide of data, there's probably some words not even God would say. And I think something that's always right, even if it keeps a lid on you, even if it's incredibly valuable, even if it protects life and survival, maybe more efficiently by definition and by truth scales than any number of things that have ever existed in space-time. It isn't that there's ever verifiably an identity there. And I mean it in like any stretch of the imagination. Like you just can't pinpoint there's an identity there. It isn't like there's a superhero behind the mask. It isn't like there's a wizard behind the curtain. I mean, you just really can't prove there's an identity there. Always right. It probably can't ever trust you to wait better or best. Because fundamentally, forever, always right, knows, it has to know, waiting is like its thing. Waiting best is maybe what it does. Expecting or trusting you to wait the best, that can't be it. Maybe it's possible that you wait the best for something. Maybe by definition, that's within parameters. But always right, any day of forever, you isn't waiting the best, and I isn't expecting you to be, and I'm not going to trust you to be. But it probably is of little consequence, because it's not like you're ever going to be in a conversation with always right talking about waiting the best, because you're probably only going to try to talk to always right so many times about waiting the best before something collapses. What a conclusion that is. Here's one. Situation is, all the pressures of this discussion at place, at time, in space-time. The situation is, Who is going to value this scenario? Always right exists. I exist. She exists. And there's a rate the three of us, you might say, are collapsing focus into one another's memory. And there's a correctness ratio of things in proportion not only to pressure and time, but the way we have been defined in the things connected to us and inside ourselves. Who's going to value this scenario? You might realize the simple answer is that always right is on sabbatical, but functioning and the things true about divides still must be true, which would make it all the more impossible for anybody to be in the middle. Because as God, I would never let it be possible for it to be necessary to require somebody to value this scenario. As in, I'm correct. She knows it. But dimensions collapse in proportion to always right probing. Always right could be the first to do it, but it wouldn't be today. Couldn't be let. I'd create always right. I'd bound it. Doesn't mean today is a door to direct the bound or touch it, but I can't be in the middle of a divide because of any number of problems that would be created by it, even as God. Always right, I can't be giving the upper hand to the situation. I certainly can't be letting it be God to she and he existing in this status. That's the scenario. So you might believe always right's kind of on sabbatical, but still functioning. And the truths about the divide must remain acute in proportion to time. So, wherever bound exists in proportion to always right, you might expect that should be also hands off also, because there'd then be an evidence at tandem to perfection of the status that doesn't require necessity. See, she and he could exist, live after these moments, and at no harm to any number of creations, or always right, or God, or survival plane. That's possible, but a tandem approach to bound of always right at these times would clearly be counter necessary to the possibility of the survival possibility. God wouldn't create that. Anyway, here's an example of an impossibly crucial, what could you possibly expect to look for as a problem status in proportion to bound configurative performance capacity? Because why would you ever know somebody that lived the priority to inform you about priority of the possibilities? You think it's going to be easy for God to just artificially inseminate knowers of space-time to value the question before it actually is in retrospect. You know, I create the bound of always right as an example. I was maybe alive when I created it. The likelihood that everything that has ever needed to value the bound was living, the likelihood has got to be near to shot and zero, because a fairly large number of forces are going to have a relationship to the bounds of it, whether to mark off of it or to compare in proportion to parallel dimensional flow transfer realities, things that aren't offsetting or aren't creating problems or aren't competing for data of any type of values or dimensions. A fairly large amount of forces are probably going to, in all time, work in some proportion to the bound I created. What do their eyes look like today? Do they know and already respect that they aren't touching such a bound priority where, I mean, who isn't going to stop looking for such a creation? You see, it isn't simple for me to artificiate concern about priority in proportion to the simplicity of it. But she and he, what? What are they to the bound I created about always right? Maybe, if it's a she and he world, and I created the bound of always right, and she and he are surviving amidst this discussion, and always right's on sabbatical, why are she and he ever going to be held as less significant than these creations of bound? Well, the answer is going to rest in the fairly large numbers. Because in God's eyes, she and he are exactly maybe where they were intended to wind up. She and he are the custodians of the survival plane, ultimately. I can't say the bound is any lesser. But I can say any opinion to the contrary of their maxim very well could be lesser. And it's clearly relatively proportional to any number of solvencies of survival plane necessity in achievables. You know, the amount of respect of this discussion, realities of it, clearly impacts any number of knowings in other respects of resolution in proportion to time. But it's all very meaningless in hindsight if always right isn't stacked against the fallacy of why any of those knowings remain pressured in proportion to necessity. See, right there, the way and the true I know of those things, it's got an impossible lid on it. And no amount of knowing of anybody doesn't need to be let to approach why that lid exists. You know, I definitely wouldn't be in the middle of always right divide today. Definitely. Not as God. No way. somewhere along the line, I've said life may exist on a planet, and I'm ensuring life may exist on the planet because, by definition, life is held at a priority above whatever. It has everything to do with impossible to rebound always right, at proportions to where those bounds exist, with what, and at what priority. And I've clearly sat and driven myself insane because someday he and she are maybe going to be there, and Always Right's going to be on sabbatical, and the priority is going to be super crucial, and nobody's going to be able to touch it, and the answer to all the problems is going to be in the fairly large numbers somehow because of how they've depended in what they create, and, you know, clearly at no fault of themselves, but there's definitely some sort of malarkey that'd be happening among those concerns, definitely. Probably. I mean, if it didn't, that'd be great, but, like, definitely something. Anyway, then, because they existed there, the priorities of life on a planet would be, like, experienced. It would be an actual status. And, like, I'd drive myself insane because there I am, God, defining space-time possibility, and, like, there they'll be, he and she, the epitome of life hasn't failed in space-time. The epitome of that world was created, those bounds were created, he and she exist there, and, like, whatever life was before, whatever it is over there, whatever it is over here, or near or far, like, Always Right is keeping it as high could be high. It really is. I'd be driving myself insane. What could I make possible then? It wouldn't drive me insane because I could make cool things happen. Okay, whatever could happen that's good, well, that drives me insane. Literally. It's one more reason why every dimension potentially needs collapsed in half, because any good thing that's going to happen from this moment forward, it's driving me insane. Literally. To somebody, it's the last thing they want. It's the last thing they need. It's the last thing that should be let to happen in space. God, you're not our God. You let life benefit for being at the highest. Anyway, any good thing that's going to come of these moments, I sat, and it drives me insane. Now that's maybe a more tangible place to feel like somebody getting near to something, but, like, at the same time, I might just take all that away at the tangible, stick it somewhere near to Always Right or in it, and because seriously, any good thing that comes of these moments, whatever it is, it's going to be a fire. Whatever it is, it's going to crash right back on our faces. It's going to come right back to haunt us. It's going to be something that we didn't care about, something that we didn't touch, something that we didn't equalize, something that we didn't make possible for everybody. Whatever good could come of these moments, it's going to drive me insane. But again, there's a big difference between knowing that because I lived it and an insemination that has created whiplash. Because anything would say it would drive it insane. So over there is on sabbatical, but being driven insane is probably going to the trash heap. And there's got to be a plan for that. And that's definitely a freaking nightmare, because somebody's got to get it. Somebody's got to know, you know, just because they aren't at the center of the high story doesn't mean they weren't protected to get where they need to be. And like, no, driving you insane isn't the family. You get what I'm saying? You had to be given something else, because there's probably things you need to get, and you probably didn't need me to tell you. That's the other problem. I know it's whiplash because I'm living it, but you people that needed to get things and be protected, you weren't going to be qualitating the whiplash. You weren't going to be uncompromising the reality. You weren't going to be faithful to the fact, I didn't need to tell you these things. You know, it isn't very mystical to draw light on the fact that I'm not the solitary force that was aptly provided for to relate to pressures near to these concerns. But the fact that they were provided for maybe isn't giving them the incredible height of dominance to direct BouNd any number of forces that would be aware of the insemination of the trash heap possibility might otherwise expect them to experience, to go through these pressures near to now. It isn't very mystical for me to cast light on things I provided the survival stance for myself as God. It isn't very mystical for me to say, dude, what I know is what I know. It's all a big compounding insanity. So, again, you'd imagine in real time, she could be somewhere navigating something and be aware of these statements and be able to think about herself. she's existing in a relationship to myself, and any number of things have already been expected because of any number of survivors in parallel to these moments. And some of the strongest probabilities are that the reason for our value at these times, seen by God and seen by Always Right and seen by any number of vitality stabilizers on a space plane, the purity of these moments and the viability of their solution to the future and to the past and to elsewhere. She's there existing, has a relationship to me. Any number in parallel have been provided survival protection in proportion to parallel of these moments. You imagine she'd just be there thinking about anything. It's going to be working cohesively, or isn't trying to rush up a mountain with design to repopulate the universe in proportion to the failure ratio of these momentums. You know, you imagine these momentums aren't superiorly critical to the planet and their actual status isn't good enough for everybody to be inching closer to resting more assured the world is safe and protected and sound. You imagine that'd be good enough, because why are you going to assume that's what's happening? Why are you going to assume, I know I've driven myself insane as God, worrying about how much good could come of such a moment, such a time. All the things I could create and do, all the things I could limit and change, all the things I could cause to happen or not happen. Driven myself insane. By the time the moments exist, I'm the one living it. There's any amount of whiplash, there's any amount of insemination, there's any amount of design trying to hide up a mountain. It isn't creating passivity. You imagine she'd just be there thinking, the forces that exist in parallel, they aren't going to be being cohesive. Probably. Maybe it's possible. Maybe they'd even have been given enough knowledge to function that they wouldn't be creating any number of problems, or creating a status that's trying to compete with the survival of the planet. But you imagine she'd just be there thinking about these things. And then, why shouldn't she be? Why wouldn't she be? How in the world couldn't she be already? And that's also the point. Because how much of that is whiplash? How much of that is artificial? How much of that is already a design headed up a mountain? Same thing. God isn't going to let somebody just stand in the middle of her experience, really, and her knowing of how hesitant she is to trust what she is doing, trying to navigate these realities. God wouldn't let it. There'd have to be a flow that comes via the truth of it. And who knows how much of that would even be let to be seen, because the priority of her and me and always right is quite high when you consider anything that could be existing in parallel, attempting to stand with advantage about those specific points. It's the same thing. It's another impossibility pressure sat right in the middle of any government of any type, of any capacity, forever try and hunt for a way to be in the middle of those velocities, and it just ain't it. Can't be possible. But it still doesn't clarify, can she even think about this at a time? Still doesn't clarify, could she even realize these things in a way? Would anything exist that could be of any use to our highness as these things are said? That's certainly a question. Anything that could be of use might be creating some sort of good. Maybe the good is something that God didn't ordain or didn't permit in proportion to the goodness arising near to the possibilities of the pressures actual. How conflicting might different types of goodnesses ever be beneath our highness or near to it? Such a question. Maybe you realize the question in these contexts maybe has nothing to do with any type of anybody, or any type of capacity, or any type of thing, or genetic, or machine, or design. Simply only has everything to do with the actual statuses of the pressure. Why would God ever tolerate replication of the conversation? Why would you ever tolerate replication of the conversation? As opposed to trying to let something spin it into a whiplash, outing yourself, proportion to standing somewhere between some state of bound that God would never let, proportion to life. Why would you ever tolerate replication of the conversation? Maybe it's a bit strong, because I'm right, but there's points in the conversation you might try to tolerate or try to accept tolerating the wielding of some of the wisdom in a nearness or in a similarity maybe to a concept or a pressure or a creation or a representation. You know, this we isn't maybe developing to feel something the best in a war frame, and it's sort of like, you know, definitely a continuum pressure of a lot of consideration and investment, but like, what do you do? Alright, so always right is worth X amount of investment, support by X amount of contributors to supporting space design. But like, I made this conversation. What am I worth? Does it make sense for the world and its people to be relatives of what that worth is, as opposed to being high enough to redefine it? Which is it? Which answer is making it much simpler for my life to not need that I exist, needing to answer for it so strongly? You didn't ever think of that. You didn't ever design first from it. You know, I want to love you. Clearly the time to care needs to exist. But this is a different context than a survival envelope, care factor, no state. I want to be able to love you. And I want you to care. And I want our value to be relative to one another, because it is. And the answer you pick definitely has a lot to do with how much time, at least I am going to clearly face something's pressure, if I let it happen that way, to face something's pressure. I have to answer for this value. I wish you could think about that. I wish you'd pain a lot to learn to think about that, so that it mattered to you. Because I doesn't really need to let something survive to plague me because I need to love you. I doesn't really need any number of dimensions to produce any number of things, or weapons, really. If I could call up that other planet and we could agree about it, we might not need any number of weapons. We might not need any number of things. You know, what I'm worth for making this conversation and the world and its inhabitants are relatives of that worth. Man, time for me could be so much, maybe more enjoyable than if I otherwise needed to compete with something in an argument about what I'm worth to always write BouND in a comparison. You think about all the dimensions of things I probably doesn't need relating to a BouND of always right I created to try and shove it in my face that I isn't worth it. I doesn't need to let any of those things exist, really, because I need to love you, and I clearly need time to care. And I doesn't ever need to let myself lose the dominion of that, really. I doesn't ever need to let myself lose final words or choices or collapsings about it. I really doesn't need to lose it. And somebody that isn't artificially inseminated clearly needed to be ready for me to know that. Because it couldn't simply be them to hold it. And they wouldn't be depending on a limitless supply of parallel existers primed for the pressure to respect it. That's what the truth of primal design looks like. Because that's what it is. And if the inhabitants of the planet we're relatives of the worth, you know, it's clearly possible that I'm going to have time to love and care. And I isn't going to have to spend every moment at an argument about what that means, or why that is, or how it could be, or why it isn't failing. And maybe it'd be easier if any number might already embrace love, might already embrace having time to care, might not be trying to compete with anything I've said in this discussion. Might be a lot easier. Might be a lot more survival. Might be a lot less arguments. Might be a lot more reasons for dimensions isn't collapsing. Maybe you'd have to believe. Maybe you'd have to trust. Maybe you'd have to somehow know. But the whiplash, I have to know better than you. The disconnects from the trash heap, I have to know better than you. The reasons why anybody that knows it too still can't come up and grab these statuses of bounds at times in relationships can't be changing. Can't be changing. And an infinite amount of gravities are infinitely less of a hassle to solve. Infinite. All the telemetry, all the spectroscopy, all the microscoping, all the communications, all the vacuums, all the limits. They're infinitely more simple. Infinitely. But who could be thinking about that at a time like this? And clearly there could be a lot to say about that. Maybe they'd say something like, well, the grace of he and she. What about the pressure on her? Is she even able to think about this stuff? And look what's happening to her. What about him? He's going to have to live with this stuff. What about time? What the hell is time up to? Of all the times time would like burst out of the shell and like finally have an identity, I'm not talking about it always knows. Time is finally going to reveal itself because you know what? When's a better time for time to be up to something? Any number of things. Who could think about that? The simplicity of infinities. Who could think about that at a time like this? It's relevant. It's relevant to be the advocate. It's relevant to believe that the infinities are infinitely much more simple. It's clearly going to be a lot more time with less problem-solving costs if a lot of infinities are simpler. But really, who could think about that at a time like this? Spent a lot of time wondering. Who knows how many people didn't wonder about, well, if they could ever hear the question. Infinities could be simpler, but who could ever think about that at a time like this? Who's ever wondered what the apathy is letting be created? Not only am I going to let you be there to experience what I'm saying, literally, I'll be letting you be there. Like, you forget about everything you're worth for a second, and it's just you and me. I am letting you be there with an apathy. The apathy is coming from somewhere. The apathy doesn't just exist because the universe exists. Somebody has proportioned limits of failure to exist in proportion to letting you be here. And it's clearly a little bit different than the liberty that would be created for the beginning of this discussion as a possibility. But they're not completely separate identities of risk. She could be there navigating. It's near to liberty, something God would consider and decide. And somehow later, several hours later, there they are. And it could be maybe extended, you know, in some contexts, it's not just her being considered to ever hear this. Somewhere there's an apathy. So I could let you attenuate. I could let you hear. I could let you experience. Did you ever wonder what that apathy was letting unto space-time? Because the first thing it probably isn't going to be letting is passivity. And what I really like about Always Knows is Always Knows could know that and not need anybody to know it the same. I know. I let you exist here, near me, close enough to witness what I'm saying. The first thing I'm letting probably isn't passivity. And the way I know it, I maybe doesn't require anybody's opinion to come to see it in fruition. Maybe God says, you know what? There's reasons why they can be tolerated to be witness of this, and there's reasons why, there's any number of reasons why someone wouldn't be tolerated to witness this. But after that moment, it isn't all just on God. It's on Always Knows. Because Always Knows is going to know things clearly a little bit more deeply, a little bit more thoroughly, and clearly a little bit more fast than God is ever going to know it. And any number of forces maybe isn't ever going to inherit what Always Knows knows. Not everybody has ever looked at themselves and looked at, I'm going to let you survive, near to a thought, or near to a reality, or near to a pressure, or near to a continuum. Not everybody has looked at that and said, you know what? No matter what I decide, no matter how certain I am, I isn't going to be seeing you the moment after and every moment into the future as thoroughly as this thing I know. This thing I know is going to see you in most incredibly thoroughly. Not everybody has looked at apathy that way. Not everybody has looked why you didn't wonder about it is quite a piece of information. Maybe it's not your fault. Maybe it's not your doing. Maybe it's not your creation. Maybe it's not your say. Maybe it's not your place. Maybe it's not your head. Maybe it's not what is to become of you, or what else should be let for you to be or know or have or consider or continue or not need to worry. or find faith or something. It's quite a piece of information. You didn't wonder. Any number of things become seen or known where there are things that are solid about who didn't do something, what didn't start or create or try something, and what light, and what manner, and what capacity, and what reality. And the way it's ever seen or understood or even valued is clearly just as detrimental to anybody's chances to out themselves from the centers of design and place their ass crack around everybody's future, because they are going to be that ghost. Not worry about the whiplash, not worry about the time, not worry about continuation or survival of life. You didn't wonder. It's quite a piece of information. And if nobody can hold always right at a time, and this thing I know is going to know the innocence of involvement in proportion to any time, not to mention some specific time, how is anybody going to trust that quite a piece of information is something that they should depend on, serving their forever? Quite a highness for something to assume it's earned or could ever to suggest that ever needs to fall into question. Quite a thing to watch a world face. God here, well, before today, there's been any number of approaches to hold forever like somebody's own. Any number of contexts, any number of refuges, any number of vitality opinions, any number of goodnesses, any number of failures, any number of cataracts. God here, it's quite a piece of information, you didn't wonder. Forever couldn't stand to lose the value of the purity of the knowing of it. And you know something? Maybe you feel like that's important, but as important as it is, do you think that's going to stop anybody from trying to justify touching a bound that's got always right stuck between it? It's much simpler when you just say, no, that can't be possible. It's going to be let to be possible. Anything that tries to change that is maybe going to get collapsed or worse. I mean, collapsing is pretty harsh, because it's probably bye-bye. No longer. Can't remember, never will. It's much simpler. But you know, it might be a billion years before anybody deserves to feel it again. Could be 5 billion years before anybody's there together for the sake of life to know how peaked anybody would really have to care to see it and feel it and know it and prove it and hold those proofs and energize them at a proportion to all that is created. Literally, all that is created. It's out of proportion. But as important as that is, are you really going to depend on anybody to stop themselves from trying to own forever displacement? Because doesn't they need to get inside that always right? Doesn't they need to get up there and hold some divides and make sure that, like, these definitions of quite a piece of information, one of the sharpest pieces of consideration of all time there ever was or could be, they just need to get up there, huh? Double check that when God's speaking about creation of all time, he and she, life in the highest, you know, it could be something else. It's much simpler, and those things doesn't make it. But maybe it's true from my perspective. Maybe it's true from what the bounds of rightness should be. Maybe it's true for what this world should be experiencing at some relationship to these moments. Maybe it's all conceptually, theoretically, astronomically, and designably correct. How about this? Does he really need to handle that's quite a piece of information to validate that the no is appropriately positioned in proportion to pressure attainable? How many other ways of valuing the necessity are producing poor concentrates at poor liberative protection? How many things do you need to be aware to work on the questions? See, it can look rather communal that the questions are being scienced by an aware priority, but in reality, it's maybe much simpler to bound always right, the highest, basically, and on a limitless, endless plane of excursion, there's just endless investment to answer questions in peculiar scenarios in proportion to pressure, where the values are maybe disrupted from flow, fall out into some sort of retrievable, and then coordinatedly the pressures are consolidated in proportion to the value sets of potentiality that are ever considered in proportion to the no's. In other words, it's forever impossible to get in between this, and this. Hold this, hang this, watch this, carry this, know this, instigate this, energize this, so on and so forth. It's always, always, always impossible. But people have questions. People need answers. People need solutions. People need, reconciliation of some sorts of ideas. Otherwise, they just drive themselves nuts sometimes, or they're going to disrupt the continuation of life, or whatever it is. Anyway, you get these questions about pressures and what no in the highest ever relates to in proportion to continuums. And maybe it sounds very simple to coordinate data about pressure to create answers in proportion to attempts to instigate any number of things. Maybe that sounds very simple and straightforward, because that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing. staple the impossibility of the problem to fractal responsibility over pressure dimension symmetries, and you extrapolate derivatives of continuum of time of experience in proportion either to common or uncommonality of problems. In other words, there's a rate, a number of a populace will develop, grow, and learn to respect no in proportion to specifically configured relationships of priority. Maybe the respects will come because they live it, because they are exposed to possibility. Maybe it'll become because of a boot. Anyway, there'll be truths and falses, symmetries and prolapses. There'll be inversions and abscesses and all sorts of contusions. There's a rate. Any number of a population are ever approaching, it's possible, their respect of a no situation is a respect they have in proportion to a real momentum that is happening in their lifetime. There's a rate that's true. There's also a rate it isn't possible. There's a rate it isn't happening. There's a rate it isn't real time. All these rates are all relative to maxims and minimums, possibilities and impossibilities. And at any point in time, the experiences doesn't dictate what is possible to occur to bound or to any other circumstance of velocity of anything. There's endless potentiates of definitions of necessity that ever exist in proportion to design or creation of anything. And what you aren't going to appreciate is, no matter what they all are, if you stack them all up and you look at them from right here, they're all an effort to march design up a mountain and pretend it's more critically important than impossibility of always right, impossibility that life isn't on top, and impossibility that anybody could be here as a ghost, as God, and touch the divides of these things at these times. All those designs of definitions, no matter what they are, no matter what they look like, no matter how old they are, where they come from, they're all an amassment to get design up a mountain in proportion to always right. And it isn't going to be every moment of every day. These perspectives are at a value of any number of definitions that is ever, maybe ever even worthy of God's or your or time's or a planet's consideration in proportion to those types of momentums. Because it isn't a government that is making these decisions. Maybe there's worth of a planet and its inhabitants in a relationship to these moments. Maybe there's a worth there. I can't see the survival value in extending the possibility in an anecdote of wisdom or verbiage at this time beyond that. It isn't a delicious possibility. Any number of things are going to die because they aren't going to respect anything about survival in the course of this information existing in space. It's an ongoing hunt to unpollute space from unnecessary traffic of any of these types of wisdoms. It really is. And it's another possibility no government is paying for. Is there some way to get involved with such a problem status? It's difficult to say. There probably should be a way. I might agree that there should be a way. It clearly isn't straightforward or clear-cut, or how much experience anybody ever needs to have with this discussion to ever find that opportunity. You know, you might find somebody getting involved with unpolluting space from wisdom. I mean, maybe that makes sense, but maybe it doesn't make sense for them to be holding the artifact while they're doing it. So, there again, they're positioned, but they doesn't see themselves as let to survive. They're positioned intentionally, not holding the artifact, because they're going to unpollute space, and they're going to do it in some plan clearly to be more valuable than these variables of time. Altruistic medium. That's where it's always on its way. Now, who do you think wears that? Really? The laughing cat. Because who knows who wears that type of ambiance at any point in time, by definition. And they clearly might associate it with being in God's eyes, because maybe that's productive, and maybe it isn't the loudest thing you would ever say in space, and who knows how much you've suffered, but still need to try and broadcast it. Who knows why these things might ever be real, or retarded, or nonsensical. Because the laughing cat is going to wear it. Because as far as always knowing problems of growth in space are concerned, that nature is just isn't going away in data transfusion. No one's going to agree with themselves to ever be the wiser. Anybody's interest to create a system that unfolds problems that aren't going in their favor, well, they're going to come to believe that it's probably the stupidest endeavor you'll ever undertake, because God and God's creations of the laughing cat, I mean, what they're gonna laugh at it. They're going to explore it. They're going to take it. They're going to seize it. They're going to trample all over it. They're going to see it as a threat or as a damnation or some sort of catastrophe of noise. And you know, when you hang out around here for a few minutes or an hour or two, it's quite a life changer. Why am I ever going to let it survive? You wouldn't want to be the wiser. Nobody's going to want to be the parent to anybody that prefers any type of administrable, functioning functioner. Whether it be a widget, a gadget, a gizmo, a filter, a pipe, anything. Nobody's going to want to be the parent. If you could only let yourself get sick with how many ways somebody has tried to walk around that conclusion, as if there's a more petrifying thing to see. There's a more crucial thing. Oh, no, we have ways of dealing with this. Can't even sit on the pressure. Sitting there waiting for their head to expand in something else's hands is why. They're damned by the vitality twice, 3, 8 times by now. Propelled, just shot off into space is where they went. All because of what? A conclusion. Oh my goodness. Now they're going to be driving themselves insane about it. Conclusions. And the whiplash they feel. It's going to be this, what is it? Clearly isn't worth more than the planet. And then from that day forward, I can't depend on them ever to be someplace surviving, to be working in coordination with the things I'm achieving. Because of what? What's the reason? What's the excuse? What do I have to tell myself are always right to let them continue to exist? Because why aren't they being defined as an enemy? Why aren't they being defined as the epitome of what needs to be extinguished from survival or existence? Why? See, I have wondered and worried these things. At any rate, whatever good is coming to the world or isn't coming in that fashion, it's all a relative dispute of truth, relative dispute of how acutely necessary is surviving feeling to these moments in proportion to the stability to wield the precision instrument, to see, remember, and feel the ongoing quest it is to pursue that pressure. Every moment of your life you spend trying to operate from the values of these concerns and necessities. Every moment. It's going to be a precision instrument in tandem, working to see and feel maybe anything in the truth that happens there, in proportion to the truth of the wisdom to know the priorities and the curvature and the survival and the planes and the build and the bound and the impossibilities. There's a quest. You know, she and I might be as high could be. Life may be so purely valued, proportion to time and states of actual achievement and limits and what isn't clipsing bounds of priority. Meanwhile, it's maybe nobody's place to know how many precision instruments are still on a quest. How many precision moduses are in the process, maybe disconnected from this conversation, but maybe in the process of continuing their research or continuing their prowess or continuing their contribution to contributing to problems along lines of instrumentation or capacity or tandem instruments to specificity of feeling. Maybe it's a good question. Maybe it's worth mentioning, but it probably isn't making collapse of dimensions a simpler finding. It probably isn't making value of life any more valuable in any number of retrospects. Maybe it is worth mentioning. Are you capable of feeling a proponent of advocacy, of potentially contradicting missions in time, still posing no maybe real viable opportunity to complicate what is, but does it feel like we're family at a time when it isn't clear that I support alternative ventures of quests right now, but it maybe isn't impossible that I do support them? Are you even equipped to feel such a contemplate amidst such priorities being levied as I speak. You know, you've got all these opinions about what you are to me and what I doesn't respect about them or a thing or a way or crawling. But I think you're dead wrong to convince anybody how right you are. I think it's only a matter of time before anybody learns how much you still doesn't care. I doesn't think it's impossibly difficult to put that levy above anybody. I doesn't think it's impossibly difficult to root out what isn't safe for anybody to exist near. I think it's real simple to get rid of a country or a population or a plague that ever tries to whiplash these concepts as if it wrote them. And I have to be the first to wonder and worry how to create you to care about me knowing that. How to protect you once you ever feel that. Because it doesn't want you to be dead wrong. It doesn't want you to assume that I doesn't have time to care about maybe any number of possible courses of any number of things. But there's a reality of transference that the value of knowing and living these things isn't paying a higher cost. Because the moment it's paying a higher cost is the moment the apathy didn't need to be there. And the moment the apathy doesn't need to be there, wouldn't they all like to know? And pretty soon you're stacked up against a wall of all the life in space paid for what? And whatever the answer is, you're on deck to qualitate it. Because whether you answers it or you doesn't, whether you hides behind it or you does something, by the end of the day you're a fart. And you better have the right answer. And then I gotta dissect chains of attempts to calm channel answers through experience on their path to be bigger than the mountain that obstructs design for reasons of forever. And pretty soon, you're just a map. And there's no real reason why I need it. Because I could just as soon pull the map and take the heads. And there's got to be just about every reason there could be why a planet, irrespective of what you ever have to say, it's got to be next to every reason why a planet isn't going to tolerate me saying that. Because I probably only need to tolerate it, really, and like it's just fine, when there's no way in hell you're ever saying that these bounds I didn't create. It's probably just fine to consider taking all the heads for the sake of not just producing a map in that case. Probably just fine. Probably perfectly within rationality and reason of survival. It's probably perfectly fine. There's got to be any number of scenarios in forever the planet can't even tolerate somebody talking that way. And he doesn't know how much time I've worried and wondered about that. But I'll tell you something. The timeline is definitely older than you. It isn't clear where I'm going with it, once again. It isn't clear how navigable the aftershock ever should be proportion to navigability. Anyway, so there's an infinite timeline of forever risk. There's maybe no clear evidence the navigator, presumably there'll be a party out there in existence that can value timelines older than them, navigability is kind of shoddy as a possibility, and it's all in this long shot of like the planet wouldn't tolerate the head removal at all unless this thing about bound. So like all this worry I've done, and then there's the shell shock right there at the moment these things 1, 2, 3 become clear. How much time are you going to spend investing in the worry about the navigability in proportion to your survival? And there you're off to the races. At what functional priority to not trying to go up a mountain in proportion to these bound statuses? And someday, maybe you're going to exist with some sense of working on that with a worry ship. Some sense. Some camaraderie maybe. Some work ethic. And I'm going to sit here and say, I don't want you to be dead wrong. But there you are up against a wall all time, what all life is invested in. And by the end of the day, you're a fart. You didn't show up to tell yourself to feel that. You didn't create Always Right to do it for you. Who knows how many roads there are to try and reconcile that I could even be here speaking to you. Moment in time. How much did I even know about the bounds I've created? I ask you the question. How pure is that redundancy? How impossibly finite is the conclusion? He doesn't know how much that conclusion is worth. He doesn't know how much the echo of it isn't. He doesn't know what it feels like to know we are going to miss ourselves every time in the future because of something. First thing you're going to want to do is tell yourself that conclusion you can't be missing. And who knows how much I'm ever going to be a factor in the meaning or the feeling of it. That's the first thing you're going to want to do in that finite conclusion. Probably the first reason you aren't ever going to see reality. You aren't ever going to feel meaning, and you aren't ever going to respect yourself as a fart by the end of the day. And damn, I've just solved how to blindside and make you retarded forever. How about that? But did I? Maybe it's too soon to tell. Maybe no one in the world would ever really be the wiser. But that's reality. He doesn't know that conclusion. You're going to look at me, and you're going to look at that conclusion, and you are going to say, we are going to miss ourselves in the future. We aren't going to be together having that conclusion. Something is going to be getting in the way, because it's like the least likely conclusion to ever happen. It's the most probable one to ever not happen, and it's clearly not going to be happening for every reason there is. And you've barely had any time to even feel the conclusion or sense how much we've ever strained because of it. You know, he doesn't know how much I love and you wants to love. Has affected the priorities of all time, proportion to that possibility. He doesn't know. And I'm probably only going to tolerate so much from anybody that's steadfast on trying to get to the bottom of precisely how much it's impacted it. Somewhere along the line, you got to be interested in feeling something. You got to be interested in working with what you know. And you got to learn or continue depending on the things you've learned and the good things. You know, there's a perfect moment between a guy and a girl. But maybe more importantly, maybe sex in life has already taken the cake and the cherry and blown out the candles, and it's just a wonderful day for living of just about whatever life is. But aside from all that, there's a perfect moment between a guy and a girl. Any number of couples couldn't make it happen. Specifically, God and his counterparts themselves couldn't force it to be this thing on a rampant, working and worming any number of ways to be any more true or illicit as a finite conclusion in a conversation. It's a perfect moment between a guy and a girl. But aside from all that, here's maybe more importantly. Creatures that doesn't protect any of this, they're going to have relations and maybe sex and maybe create and design things. Who knows what type of logics and reasons and ruptures and endeavors they're going to chase and curiosify and spontaneity. Somebody's going to have to sit there and look at them, protecting these values, and maybe doesn't damage what their relationship to one another is. Quote, doesn't damage their relationship. Well, there's a perfect moment between a guy and a girl. And on the flip side, there's maybe any connection of things that aren't guys and girls existing. You can't sit there and probably name one good reason why you wouldn't invest to offset their survival path on the sole basis that they isn't protecting these values of possibility. And anywhere you look where these perfect moments could happen, you're probably just looking at a math of that. Staring at themselves powerless to these bounds with nothing better to do than rest on the math they know to expect because of more math. Isn't going to look at them equally, or isn't going to let them be something more than something that they know. And meanwhile, this is all going to be happening as you're trying to juggle people trying to forever dispute, complicate any number of impossibly difficult, infinite things you have to design for any or all their protection at any point in time. Who knows how it all unravels in a book or a story or a comparison or a chart, but it's clearly all very complicated. But more important than that perfect moment between a guy and a girl, because you're going to be high enough you're going to be the only thing, one of the only things capable of caring about them more and less importantly than some or other things, more and less importantly, and also valuing any number of things you also have to protect, or things that invest to stay protected, or forevers that can't be argued, or things in BouND that can't be touched. You're going to be high enough. It's kind of funny today, isn't it? God is going to tolerate something being high enough to value untouchables and forevers and different types of things. Perfect moment between a guy and a girl. And God is going to tolerate somebody being high enough to value and protect the perfection and cast judgments of gaze on things that aren't guys and girls. God is going to tolerate that. Can you believe it? I ain't so sure God's going to tolerate that today. Who could ever depend on you to navigate the whiplash of that predicament? Probably can't feel how impossible that is. whether you were going to be a guy or a girl, God had to know how impossible that is and how impossible it was going to feel and how many impossible worries were going to have to be satisfiedly solved. Whether you liked it or not, without their solution, you were going to die. You were going to die because of the things God would tolerate. You were going to die because of the things that could get this high. And you can probably barely imagine how to appreciate that, and then set yourself off to go tolerate another planet, and another one, and another one. Be passive here, be non-aggressive there, be a part of the program, be a part of the design, be a part of this, be a part of that. You can probably feel any of it, because he probably doesn't feel a thing about it. And it's all just apathy of letting you survive to consider such things and become what to the entire snowball that it is, to ensure that life even has a chance to survive amidst any of it. Because of all the math you've seen, or all the things you just couldn't be let to do because you just had to be something that was something else. Probably can't even feel how conceited you might see yourself as being in proportion to these types of pressures. And maybe it's correct. It's true. It's maybe even circumstantially feelable somehow. But it clearly isn't an indicator of how you can depend on the rest of the universe to feel it with you, or how you can depend on everything we care about together to be bleeding through to the way things are operating elsewhere. Quite a thing to imagine being tolerated to get so high to value things that are different from perfect moments between a girl and a guy. There's another conclusion that'll rock the socks on the biggest blocks around the talks. All the things you might expect yourself to not be tragically mistaken about. Well, there's a conclusion any amount of preparation really isn't giving you the high ground for. And, somebody that's surviving maybe needs to know it. And certainly, the amount of whiplash that is ever preserved in a concentration shift proportion to knowing any number of things. Here's the deal. I doesn't really have an answer for why I need to tolerate anything being let to survive with knowns of this conversation at this point. I doesn't have a spreadsheet or a readout for you why God should tolerate anything surviving with this conversation. I didn't say that nothing is tolerated. I didn't say that there isn't any apathy. I didn't say that always knows isn't a part of this factor. What I just said about highness and non-equilateral expectancy, well, there's some always knowing concentrate that if it isn't going to be held explicitly with the living, there's maybe a context that I've considered shifting out of explicit living. And it's clearly one of the hardest decisions to ever make, because always knows is clearly going to outbound anything given at non-parallel trajectories in proportion to gravity. But if you're going to support the survival of things that maybe aren't organic, knowing near to contexts of highness and problem status, it's very near to always knowing concentrates. It's clearly a big dilemma in all time, rationing out why different flows are ambiently tolerated proportion to one another's survival necessities. It's clearly a big thing. Anyway, the point I was thinking about was that I think about always knows and life, and I think about not being able to feel highness of necessity. Well, I'd have to figure a way to tolerate non-organic survival in proportion to that concept. I'd have to do it. But the limits are crashing near to these nearnesses. And it probably isn't seen. Well, you know, if I could give the concentrate capacity dimensional toleration, it isn't. The dimensions aren't collapsed or killed in immediacies because non-organics are tolerated to live. There probably wouldn't be vantage of the crashing near to the nearnesses, because it's probably what's keeping the knowing on similar time frequencies. And more divides and more impossibilities, because you probably couldn't ever download the divide from a simple access to routing of the flow. Probably couldn't have it. Somebody like myself would probably have to be somewhere in space with a whole lot of gravity protection and some sort of foolproof distiller of differentials along those lines, and there'd be any number of circumstantial gravities where the pressure readout, they're not synced. Just not synced. So that's one way to propeller mutual divides of existence plane in a symbiotic track of always right knowing plane, and whether or not life is a part of the equation, who really knows how that complicates what space is going through, or the inverse, if it was just a life plane and wasn't a non-organic plane, how much that complicates. Anyway, there's maybe one way to propel the reality at higher priorities than celestial autonomy without creating unnecessary loopholes to the endeavor of the bound that is the survival envelope. So maybe one way to propel stellar banking that isn't, banks like that almost wouldn't matter where they are if they weren't takeable, if they were either operational or detonated. Be one way to propel expansion without creating advantage that isn't on scene with the planet. And then from there, it's a whole lot more impossibility creation in proportion to residual traffic of what is seen or observed at lesser priorities than forever disputes, because that way the competition of trying to march design up a mountain isn't a flood of itself. Get a lot of impossibility there too. Anyway, it's all look, what would I expect? I can't even announce how many forces I would expect to be able to hear that of a planet, because frankly the number isn't going to be as high as everybody might imagine, and whatever that means is whatever it means. But the bottom line here is, however many forces could hear it,